Hello everyone, welcome back to another video in our series. Here we're going to tackle endpoint security capabilities. In this video we're going to check out basically the client and the server operating system security options, but we'll pay a bit more attention to the client side here, seeing as we did touch on the server side in the network hardening, as servers are a pretty important network entity. Nonetheless though, we'll talk about both. So let's get into some endpoint security implementation. First up, endpoint hardening. So firstly, operating system security. You need to consider, are you dealing with a client, a server, or a mobile device? As these different kinds of operating systems are going to be bringing different benefits and drawbacks and challenges to the table when it comes to implementing good cybersecurity. Now the clients, you've got to remember that it's going to definitely have a graphical user interface. It's going to have end user applications. It's probably going to have a variety of applications as well, seeing as your end users are going to have quite a few different tasks they need to do. And remember, the more applications that you need to have, the more likely you're going to have a variety of vulnerabilities on that system. Whereas at least with a server, it's a lot easier to minimize on the amount of applications present on that machine, as you can make that server single function and beyond just what's needed for that particular network service application to work. And for administrative capabilities, not much else is really required to be installed on a server. And then with mobile operating systems, the big thing you want to take away with those bad boys is that they are actually designed with the consumer in mind, not the enterprise. So their mobile operating systems are not going to be chock full of useful features for enterprise security, but I'll tell you later on in this video how to start dealing with that. And in case you doubt me, think about any advert you have seen for a smartphone that tries to convince you that this product will make you a better professional, a better worker. It's not targeting the company, it's targeting you, so that you are going to be awesome and get that promotion and all that nice stuff that comes with it. Now, borrowing from a topic that we mentioned in the last video, let's talk about a good secure baseline configuration. What you want to do is have a look at a few key things. Firstly, what kind of interface are you planning for the user to be engaging with? Is it going to be a graphical user interface, or is it going to be a command line interface? You want to keep in mind that the graphical user interface does add a lot of convenience to the end user's experience, but it does come with a drawback. And that drawback is there's a lot of applications, there's a lot of extra stuff added to the operating system to make it nice and user-friendly. It is the reason why a lot of server operating systems will come without a graphical user interface and just offer you a command line. In the case of Linux, that's not surprising. But if you click your way through the installation of a Windows Server OS, I guarantee you're going to be sitting there with pretty much command prompt and PowerShell, and that's it. Because with a command line, it's a bit more secure, it's a bit more stable, and you don't need as much to have a working machine. But obviously we can't do that to our end users. I mean, can you imagine your users at your workplace not having a graphical user interface and having to do all of their work through the command line? You're going to have a very bad time trying to get that right. So what we tend to do is we say, okay, cool, go for the graphical user interface on the clients, but you can do things to remove features and components and even full applications that the user does not need. Things like group policy for Windows, for instance, can actually help you do that. And then stick with CLI for the servers, obviously. Then review what services you are going to need on that machine. Are you going to need all of them, or could you remove the ones that are unnecessary? Because an unnecessary service is an executable just waiting to be exploited. Even if there are no known exploits right now, there could be in the future, and for all you know, there could be a 0-day right now waiting to come your way. So, as I normally advise with the services, disable the ones you're not using, and if it's one that you're not using but something you do use needs it, a dependency basically, yes, then you can keep it around. But if it serves no purpose, all it's doing is just adding greater vulnerability to your system. Also review your open and listening TCP/IP ports, especially on the clients actually, because you might discover some interesting applications busy communicating with external entities. These applications might be doing a bit of marketing, or it could be a remote access Trojan phoning home. You never know. But do some scans, check it out. The servers will be a little bit easier to predict what you're going to see, but definitely check anyway on a regular basis, because the servers are usually the thing the attackers are more interested in, as they normally have the more valuable data assets that are worth targeting. Then look at your storage preferences. Are you going SSD? Are you going mechanical? Are you using self-encrypting drives? Are you using cloud storage? What are your options, and what are the trade-offs for the security and the benefits for the system? In some cases, you'll also get some benefits for security and trade-offs for the system, but look at your storage preferences and take advantage of any and all security options that are going to be worthwhile and beneficial without having too much of a significant impact on the user experience. So when it comes to items for reviewing your baseline, you know what? It's a never-ending list. There are so many things you could look at. Basically, you just want to sit down and say, could this thing affect my security? Yes or no? If yes, okay. What can we do about it? Could we maybe minimize the risk? Could we completely remove the thing? We want to go through those kinds of exercises. But let's go with some endpoint hardening advice that could be quite useful, especially for your end user machines. And the first thing you might want to start considering is physical interface protection. With desktops and laptops, what you're going to be probably most concerned about is USB. And you can do things like, for instance, deploying a policy that blocks USB mass storage, which is obviously kind of useful, as this will limit the ability for USB flash drives and external hard drives to be used as an exfiltration technique. But we do have some special threats to watch out for. For instance, you get something called a rubber ducky. I promise I do not make these names up. But a rubber ducky is a USB flash drive that, when plugged into a computer, presents itself to the computer as a keyboard, not a flash drive. And if you have a policy enabled that prevents USB mass storage, well, that policy is not going to help, because the computer thinks it's a keyboard. And then the little microcontroller in this device starts sending keystrokes, or basically a predetermined script of characters, into the machine as though you were typing. This can be incredibly quick and incredibly dangerous, as essentially the attacker could plug in and a bunch of commands run, setting up whatever they need to have set up. Not a fun experience. And like I said, this thing can look like a flash drive. In fact, you could actually go and build your own one if you're brave enough and you go do a little bit of research online. I guarantee you there's a couple videos on YouTube that you can go and check out on how to build one of these, for educational purposes, obviously. Then another interesting physical interface threat that you might need to think about protection for are USB killers. USB killers, again, look like flash drives, but what they do is they fry your computer. Generally what happens is it's going to look like a flash drive, and it's going to have a bunch of microcapacitors on. You plug it in, it takes a charge, and then through some crafty electronic circuitry, it releases that charge back into the motherboard, causing damage. Now, some machines do have shielding to protect against that, so the most you're going to do is lose that USB port, but not the whole computer. And it's becoming a very common feature of enterprise machines to have that. And you might say, why would somebody want to do that? First of all, remember, some threat actors like to watch the world burn. Secondly, it's another interesting way of pulling off a denial of service. Those are your physical interface concerns, but there's a load of other concerns that you might want to deal with as well. Like storage encryption. Well, not just storage, but also transmissions as well. You want to consider, what are you doing for your storage encryption? We're going to talk about it a bit more just now, but the short answer is you want full disk encryption to minimize on the risk of the hard drive or SSD being stolen. And you want file level encryption to make sure that files that you don't get access to remain encrypted, and vice versa. It's a very good idea to do this. With transmissions, we want to ensure that we're using encrypted communications and the strongest cipher suites possible, so that we can keep ourselves nice and protected. Speaking of, one of my favorite pieces of advice is to take advantage of your host-based firewall. A lot of people look at things like the Windows firewall, or what's it now, the Windows Defender firewall with advanced protection or something along those lines. I must double check. But either way, it is the Windows firewall, and people laugh at that. But you know what? That might be the last line of defense before a network threat gets onto the machine. And a general rule you want to follow is the closer you position the firewall to an endpoint that it is trying to protect, the stricter and more precise the rules can be, as it is closer to the endpoint, and the stricter rules are unlikely to mess around with some other device. And you're not going to get any closer than the firewall installed on the machine. So you might as well take advantage of it and customize it. But wait, what about the end user? What about them? You can go and take advantage of the host-based firewall for them as well. I probably wouldn't go and customize it on a user-by-user basis. What I'd probably go and do is say, oh, let's go and do it for all the accountants. Let's go and set up a nice host-based firewall set of rules that will work nicely for most of the accountants. And if we have any problems where we're blocking something by accident that we shouldn't be, we can obviously fix it quickly and easily. Then consider a good endpoint protection platform. We're going to have a good look at that just now, but the endpoint protection platform is going to take the antivirus concept and take it quite a few steps further. So hold on, we'll get there just now, I promise. As always, change defaults. Please, any default setting, especially if it's got anything to do with access or security or anything, change the defaults. And in fact, useful piece of advice, change the computer name as well, so that when you're looking at it through a network connection of any kind, you have an easier time figuring out what device this is, especially when you deploy a Windows server, as that often gets some crazy random name with a default installation. And as always, if you don't need the software, take it away. But remember one thing, you and I might think, oh, we don't need this tool, we can work without it, but the user might need a tool in particular. So always remember to think and work like the user does when deciding what software to keep and what software to remove. If you're not sure, speak to the user. Ask them if they use it or not. Ask them what they use it for. Stuff like that. It'll help to make sure that when you do this, you're not going to cause more problems than you're solving, at least from a user experience perspective. But let's talk a bit more about the endpoint protection and what we have to help us here. So first up, your network actually can do a lot of good here. If you've been doing some segmentation, you will have hopefully done security zoning and placed endpoints in groupings in the network, LAN segments, whatever you want to call them, based on shared security requirements, and you're doing some filtering for traffic coming and going to those network segments. But you might even want to take this a step further, like full isolation in response to things like malware and other kinds of network-based threats. All right, now with disk encryption, we spoke a bit about this in a previous video, but quick recap. Full disk encryption, where the whole hard drive is encrypted or decrypted, or maybe the full partition, it depends on what you're going with. Either way, the goal here is to make sure that if a hard drive or SSD gets stolen, it's going to be very difficult for the attacker to gain access to any data on it. Please be aware, this actually does happen more often than you would think. It's a hell of a lot easier to open a computer, whether it be a desktop, a laptop, or a server, put the hard drive in your pocket, and walk out the building than it is to try and walk out with a computer. Now, when you're doing full disk encryption, you can either go for a software-driven solution, like, for example, BitLocker or Lux or something like that, or you could use a self-encrypting drive. Whichever one you go with, though, do me one massive favor and ensure that if there is any kind of recovery key that you need to disable this in the event of an emergency or something like that, you have recorded that recovery key or that decryption key that you would need in the event of an emergency. I beg of you. It's happened too often where I've seen organizations enable these things but not worry about preserving recovery keys or decryption keys for various reasons, and then they find out they need it and they don't have access to it. Next up, some file level encryption wouldn't go amiss either. The big benefit with file level encryption is you're going to be able to protect file by file, object by object. And normally with file level access, as you log in, the stuff you get access to is decrypted for you, but stuff you don't get access to remains encrypted. This also happens when someone else logs in. Your stuff remains encrypted if they're not meant to have access to it. Now, in fairness, full disk encryption is the stronger form of encryption, but it's not as persistent, as it's going to be turned off or decrypted when the machine turns on. Whereas with file level encryption, it's a bit more persistent as it only decrypts and exposes data when you are accessing. But it's not as strong when it comes to standing up to things like cryptanalysis and other kinds of cryptographic bypassing techniques. You know what does work well? Doing both. Then, patch management. This is probably one of the most underwhelming things I could tell you in this security course. Do an update. Yeah, I thought you'd find it a little bit underwhelming, don't worry. I did too when I was first taught this, but the thing is, who better to resolve a security issue than the people who built the thing in the first place? The operating system, whatnot. Just do the update. It's annoying, I will admit, because you will occasionally get the update that fixes one thing and breaks a load of other things. But normally when that happens, it's because the one thing that was being fixed was a security hotfix, and the three things that went wrong were because there was no quality control because the vendor was trying to rush that update to the market. But with patch management in the enterprise environment, you don't have to do it the same as you do it at home. Or if you even do it at home, I don't know. You do you. But in the enterprise environment, you don't have to be on the latest and greatest version of an update the moment it comes out. It is okay to be behind the latest patch level to an extent. So maybe you're like 1 or 2 weeks behind. That's fine, as long as you are always 1 or 2 weeks behind. Now, the reason why you'd want to be 1 or 2 weeks behind is to, first of all, give the vendor time to release, and if there's any crazy problems that come along, they've got a chance to fix it as well. Another nice benefit of giving yourself a bit of leeway here is you also have time to test an update before you roll it out. That way, if anything goes haywire or would affect your environment in a negative way, you can identify that and figure out what to do. The last thing you want to do is roll out an update that breaks something more important to you. And then, same as earlier, hardening guides. If you come across a hardening guide for an endpoint, whether it comes from the original vendor, a community, or basically anywhere that you find good advice for making an endpoint more secure, it is worth looking at and adopting. But always do yourself a favor and adjust what you read and find for your use case. What might work well for making a hardened system in my environment might not work so well in yours. Next up, anti-malware. So I titled this anti-malware because obviously I want to talk about your conventional antivirus. Go for that. It's always a good idea to have this. Even on Linux or Mac OS, you might want to consider having an antivirus of some kind, as yes, you do get malware for those platforms, thankfully though very uncommon. But in the case of the Microsoft Windows ecosystem, oh yes, you definitely want to have some protection against malware. But we've got a few levels up now. We've got something cool called Endpoint Protection Platforms, or EPPs. Now, there's two main types of EPPs on the market at the moment. The first one is EDR, or Endpoint Detection and Response. Now, these things are pretty cool because what happens is it's got a much better scanning capability for the client, and usually it communicates with some sort of central server system, whether it be an actual dedicated server, a unified threat management gateway, or a next generation firewall. It'll be communicating with a central appliance and reporting back on the status of that endpoint. And what's quite cool is that can draw our attention far quicker to any threats and dangers on that system. Obviously it does anti-malware, as you would expect. I mean, it's a fancier version. But what's really cool are the XDRs, or the Extended Detection and Response Tools. But basically it's like a normal endpoint detection and response tool, except it's taking information from a variety of other platforms and sources. Whether it be from your cloud instances, from a threat intelligence platform, from a network alert, it takes more information and can help protect the client better. If we detect, for example, maybe a DDoS is coming through our network right now, XDR could identify where is it going and start doing things to the endpoint to make it more resilient to that DDoS attack, which would be pretty freaking cool. But you get some really amazing capabilities regardless of whether it's EDR or XDR. One of my favorite things I saw was where a endpoint protection platform from a certain vendor would identify malware on the client, notify the firewall, and the firewall would logically isolate it. by preventing anybody from communicating with that endpoint, buying us more time to more effectively quarantine that system and limit the ability for that malware to spread. Very, very cool capability in my opinion. Another thing we can also look at doing is deploying an HIDS or HIPS, host-based intrusion detection system or host-based intrusion prevention system. However, as I've always advised, this is a good idea for a server, but not so much a client. With a client, you've got a lot of applications going on there, and a host-based intrusion detection system or prevention system would be kind of resource hungry and slow down and negatively affect the user's experience. Plus, if there are any false positives, you're going to get a load more than you really want because it's going to be on the client. These make more sense on servers. Another thing we can look at as well is user behavior analytics. Monitoring and comparing user activity to baselines and benchmarks, and when deviation starts to occur, that alerts us and draws our attention. The whole idea here is humans are creatures of habit. Yes, I know we are capable of breaking habits and making new ones, but ignoring that situation, in general, people are creatures of habit. You will do your work in a particular way. You will use your computer in a particular way. And that behavior can be helpful for figuring out, is it really that person, or is it maybe someone else who is using their computer and doing so maliciously? Now, let's move on to some endpoint configuration considerations. First up, principle of least privilege always. That applies no matter what. But you might want to include admin accounts here as well. The intent here is if somebody's a network administrator, then cool, they get admin rights for anything network related like routers and switches and whatnot. Why should they have access to the database server in any meaningful way? Same as the database admin. Why does the database admin need access to the firewall or a router? They don't. So you might want to maybe limit admins to their actual niche responsibility like you would an end user. Next thing you could also look at is doing ACLs for file access. You are able to implement network ACLs on endpoints like servers to protect files. It's not a bad idea. But I always gravitate towards file access permissions, the things that are part of your operating system for dictating read, write, execute, and any other kind of relevant access that would be pertinent for a file or directory. Please take advantage of these as they are part of the system and are pretty good at enforcing the appropriate access control that you would like. Then, application control, especially for end user systems. Now, you've got two ways to do application control. You can either do an allow listing or you can do a block listing. Both will help you, but one of them will be a lot easier to do than the other without sacrificing or compromising on the effectiveness. So with allow listing, what happens is whatever is on the list is allowed to run. If it is not on the list, it doesn't get to run. The block list, on the other hand, if the thing is on the list, the program, the application, whatever, is not allowed to run. If you're not on the list, it's allowed to run. Now let me give you an example of why allow listing is probably going to be the easier way to do things. Many organizations will have an acceptable use policy that says playing video games at work on company resources is not allowed. Cool. If I wanted to block all the video games on the company computers, I'm going to spend forever trying to find every game that I want to block. And then next week when a new video game gets launched, I've got to add to that list. And let's not forget, I've got to account for all the indie games that I might not be able to discover very easily. I might have to account for games that are not going through common electronic storefronts. I've got so much to deal with there. What'll be a lot easier is sitting down and working out all the applications that anybody could want to use and need to use at work, put those in a list and let those run. I will have to update that list over time, obviously, but I'm not going to have to deal with new software applications that I don't actually care about and I'm not probably going to keep much track of. So allow lists are way easier to deal with because you're explicitly allowing and everything else gets blocked. Then make sure you've also got monitoring capabilities enabled. Also for the endpoints that are for the end users, it's a good idea to get data and alerting features from them as well. Probably would be a good idea to link it up with something like a security information and event management platform or a SIEM to lighten the burden of an administrator or a security professional having to keep a close eye on what's going on in the user environment. And then take advantage of domains in your workplace so that you can do configuration and security policy enforcement. The two most popular ways to do this would be with group policy for a Windows environment and SE Linux or Security Enhanced Linux for, you guessed it, a Linux environment. Now, these security policies and configuration policies can be so powerful that you can fundamentally change elements and aspects of the operating system that users might have taken for granted and thought were always going to be there. For instance, you can completely change the behavior of Task Manager or even deprive users of the ability to launch Task Manager in Windows with the right group policy object being applied in the domain. So very powerful and very effective. But let's deal with the more challenging endpoints, mobile devices, and the security that comes with them. So with mobile device hardening, you're going to have some tough considerations to deal with. And a bit of a pro tip before we get in here, you're going to have to stay on top of this. The mobile device market is always evolving with new handsets coming out all the time, new versions of Android and iOS all the time, and you have to deal with the changing and evolving threats of those platforms, you guessed it, all of the time. So, what do we need to consider though, beyond just that constant staying on top of everything? Well, these devices are at a greater risk of either being lost or being stolen. The reason being, they are way more portable and they are way easier to sell. If you don't believe me, let me play an experiment with you. Let's say I steal someone's smartphone, like an iPhone or whatever, and I try and sell it. Now, I'll try and get this thing factory reset so that it's a clean device. The buyer will ask me, where's the original charger? Oh, it broke. Okay, it happens. That's sort of explainable. Where's the original box? Oh, I lost it when I was moving house recently. Where's the original receipt? It was in the box. All of which, very believable. And at the right price and to have a nice smartphone, people will look over those details. So we do need to bring those two main concerns into the conversation when dealing with smartphones and mobile device security. What is quite sad is CompTIA used to have a course called Mobility Plus several years ago, and it covered a load of nice, interesting aspects around mobile device security and just general enterprise mobile device deployment. But after one cycle of 3 years, CompTIA retired that certification and decided that A+, Network Plus, and Security Plus were enough to make up for it. Now, I used to have that certification, and in my opinion, it actually covered more than those 3 courses combined. But CompTIA made the decision, so it is what it is. Who knows though, maybe I'll try and bring some life into it in the future. Make an unofficial Mobility Plus. See what it looks like. Let me know what you think. Now, let's talk about the deployment or bringing mobile devices into the workplace. You need to plan and create policies. Don't just let it happen and start making your plans afterwards. If that's been the case already, well, you don't have to let it keep being like that. You can start creating some policies, and the way you want to bring them in, you could do bring your own device, where the employee is allowed to bring their own personal smartphone to work and use it for work. Now, doing this is a bit risky, as legally this belongs to the employee, but the data and the apps for accessing the work data belong to the employer. So what you want to do with the BYOD is very carefully think out a good policy that deals with those interesting challenges of the employee owns the device, but we own the data for work. And make it a printed and signed agreement between the employer and the employee. Another smart thing to do here would also be, on the BYOD policy, to create a list of devices that you can guarantee support for, as you want to obviously apply security settings to these devices and make them secure enough to use at work for work. So by having a list of devices that you can guarantee support for, your employees are more likely to bring one of those devices to work. If they bring some unknown, random, dodgy looking Android handset to work and it's not on the list, you can say, all right, we'll try our best, but no guarantees. And if it doesn't work, you say, hey, we guaranteed best effort if it's not on the list and this device isn't. Please bring something better. But if BYOD is too much of a risk for you, you could try corporately owned, business only, also known as COBO, where the employer issues the employee with the appropriate smartphone or tablet or whatever other mobile device is relevant, and it can only be used for work purposes. Absolutely zero personal use at all. Now, the good idea here is that decreases liability, and because it's an employer-issued device, we have full rights and ability to do what we want with this, as far as security is concerned, as far as policies are concerned, as far as anything is concerned, full rights. And because we forbade the use of personal use of this device, there should be zero implication of the employee going, but my personal stuff, as it shouldn't be there. But you know what's going to happen? People are going to do it. So maybe meeting the employee in the middle somewhere would not be a bad idea. And that's where corporately owned, personally enabled, or COPE comes in, where the employer still issues the device, but the employee is allowed to use the device personally. Now, this has got to be a bit carefully managed now, as expenses need to be carefully measured and managed, as there will be costs incurred in the personal use that should probably be paid out of the employee's pocket. Also, you're going to get some weird issues like, for instance, the employee's kid or family member using and possibly even driving up costs of that device with data, calls, in-app purchases. It all varies. So you're going to have to carefully think about those type of situations and how you're going to handle them and how you're going to monitor and measure and charge back the personal usage of this device. And then you could mix it up a little bit with the corporately owned by making it a CYOD, or a choose your own device, where the employee gets to choose a device that gets issued to them instead of just being given it and told to accept it. So here it's nice because the employee could choose an iPhone if they prefer Apple, or they could pick from a selection of Android handsets if they prefer Android. So that's pretty cool, because one of the perks of mobile devices for work is if the employee likes the device, they tend to look after it more, making loss or theft less likely. So that's a clever idea. But the real magic trick to mobile device security in the workplace is an MDM, or a mobile device manager. This is a server-based solution which will require an MDM agent application to be installed on the device. But what it's going to do for you is give you essentially the mobile device equivalent of Active Directory for managing smartphones at work. You'll be able to do some really cool things. You could do things like geofencing. You could do a partitioning where you can have personal and work stuff kept separate on the device and lock down that work stuff in various ways. Really cool options available. And what's really nice is you don't have to necessarily use what the vendor created. You can go for a third-party MDM if it's going to offer you what you want. And if you're going to go with BYOD or CYOD, you better go with a third-party one so that you can handle iOS and Android equally well. With corporately owned, however, you as an organization can decide, this is the handset, end of story, and then you can go with one that only supports iOS, for example. Then, make sure you take advantage of the mobile device's storage encryption and screen locking. Putting those two together will help a lot in the event of theft. So if somebody pinches the phone and the screen lock is enabled, they're going to have to try and get that thing turned off so we can't remotely whatever the device. But when they try and turn it back on, the screen lock prevents them from actually using it, and the storage encryption prevents the data from being accessed until the appropriate screen unlocking process is done, whether it be a PIN code or a password or whatever. Now, the thief only has one choice: factory reset. They'll be formatting the data. And you know what? They're going to be formatting encrypted data. And I can tell you this right now. It is nearly impossible to restore and crack the data if some pieces are missing. And formatting and then trying to restore the data, you're going to lose a little bit of the data. And you can't do cryptanalysis or cracking of encryption when some of it's missing. So, really cool idea. But let's move on to that remote thing I spoke about a moment ago, which is the location services. The ability to track or do remote things on this device. Now, in terms of remote capabilities that you want, in the event of loss or theft, you want to be able to remotely lock the device so that you can add an extra layer of protection. You want to be able to remotely track the device to work out whether it has been lost or whether it's been stolen and if it's recoverable. Because please be aware, you get three kinds of people when it comes to a device being lost or stolen. You'll get one group of people who lose the device and say it was stolen because for that group of people, it's less embarrassing for whatever reason. Then you'll have a group of people where the device was stolen and they'll say it was lost because for them it's less embarrassing for whatever reason. And lastly, you'll get a group of people that tell the truth. If it was lost, it was lost. If it was stolen, it was stolen. And the annoying thing is you actually can't tell which of the group of people that individual belongs to. So regardless of whether they say it's lost or stolen, you want to just track it just to figure out maybe it was lost, maybe it was stolen, whatever. No guarantee, though, that you'll be able to actually locate the device because the thieves are clever. They'll either turn it off or they'll stick it in an RFID blocking bag so that it can't communicate wirelessly, whether it be through Wi-Fi or cellular. But regardless, try and track it anyway. And then, if you believe it unrecoverable, remotely wipe the device. Now, a bit of practical advice for CompTIA. I've seen over the years when doing various CompTIA exams where mobile device security is an issue or a question, and they ask something like, oh, a device was lost or stolen, what should you do? They tend to be very big on like knee-jerk reaction remote wipe, regardless of whether it was lost or stolen. And for the exam, yeah, that's fine, I suppose. But in the real world, lock it, track it, work out whether it's recoverable or possibly lost, and if it's unrecoverable, then just wipe the thing. That way the work data is secure. But please warn the employee that the remote wipe might not be selective. It might take out personal data. And the reason why you want to warn the person is in case they did lose it and you can't tell whether it was lost or stolen, if they're lying about it being stolen and it was actually lost, they might not be so keen to keep the lie up if they find out they're going to lose personal data. So let them know about that ahead of time. Now, another thing to bear in mind as well is that most of your remote capabilities are going to need your location and data services enabled to work. So don't turn those settings off. You need both this mobile data or cell data, whichever term you prefer, and the location setting to be turned on. In fact, a good idea would be possibly to make sure that an MDM prevents those two settings from being turned off. Yes, this will drive up mobile data charges and costs, but it is necessary for these remote capabilities. Even the remote lock and the remote wipe need the location feature turned on, as it's usually tied to that option or setting. But wait, what about the GPS? Well, here's the thing. Your smartphone, your tablet, whatever, doesn't use GPS all of the time. GPS relies on the device communicating with at least 3 satellites orbiting the planet to get its exact location. It is a very, very power-hungry activity, to the point where a brand new phone would see its battery drained within 10 to 20 minutes of full GPS usage. What most smartphones and other cellular devices tend to use is geolocation, where it uses triangulation with cell towers to get an approximate location for the device. And then pings the GPS satellites to refine and get that nice precision accuracy of which side of the street you're on. So that does help a bit. The downside is, though, geolocation does use cell data. GPS doesn't. It's sort of free. It's funded by the US government, so technically the US taxpayer is funding GPS. But hey, you might as well use it then. Get your value for money, right? Then, geofencing. This is the idea of using geolocation and GPS to restrict or provide access based on where the device is in the world. It's a crafty idea. Because if the employee has a smartphone and they don't do too much unpredictable field work, you could set it up so that work data only unlocks when they're in appropriate locations and then locks down when they're away from those locations. But what's nice is combine that with the MDM, where you could partition the device from a personal and work perspective. The personal features and data and apps could still carry on working fine regardless of where you are. But when you're away from work, the device could be locked down a bit more, protecting the work data, apps, and any remote access the device might be providing. Then I want to warn you a little bit about tethering. When it comes to tethering, there are a couple different ways you can do this with smartphones and tablets, but it's always a wireless technique. So Wi-Fi is your most common network and internet access method for your mobile devices, usually because your wireless network or your wireless LAN, sorry, I prefer the term wireless LAN, is going to be a cheaper internet connection. Oftentimes it's some sort of fixed line with decent speed and little to no data restriction. Whether that be your home or your work network, either way, it's going to be a way to have cheaper, more available internet. The problem is, though, attackers know this. That's why they're going to try and do rogue or evil twin networks. A rogue access point will be an attacker's access point set up somewhere that usually has a very similar but not exact same SSID and probably no wireless encryption, just plain old open access, hoping that a user doesn't pay attention, taps it, and connects very quickly and easily. What'll be a bit more nefarious will be the evil twin technique, where the attacker impersonates the legitimate SSID and blocks the legitimate access point, thus tricking the client into connecting to it a little bit more effectively. More likely to be successful, but also a little bit trickier to pull off. So Wi-Fi can be a tethering technology. Bear this in mind, and then I'll explain what tethering is and why it's dangerous. But there are some other options. Normally your personal area networking technologies like near-field communication or NFC, which is that one that we use for that mobile device payment solution where you can pay with your phone instead of a credit card or a debit card. And Bluetooth can also be a tethering technology. Now, another concern is also if you're using your smartphone as a portable Wi-Fi hotspot. This is a double-edged sword. In one way, it's a great idea because if the person's out and about, they can turn their smartphone into a hotspot, and then their laptop, for instance, has a bit more of a safer connection to the internet than relying on a coffee shop or a restaurant or a hotel's internet. The downside is, though, your smartphones and your tablets tend to be a little bit less secure and stable compared to a proper wireless access point. So it's good in one way but weak in another. You'll have to make your own decision as an organization about whether it's okay for your users to do this or whether you'd rather them do something else for internet while they're on the road. But either way, all of these options here give us tethering capabilities. Now the problem, you can tell your device to trust or tether to that device, that network, that connection, whatever. So when it sees that Wi-Fi, when it sees that Bluetooth device, when it sees that whatever, it drops the lock screen security, making it just a little quick flick or swipe to unlock the device. Not a good thing. Now there was a period several years ago where Android and iOS devices would see a new wireless LAN, a new Bluetooth pairing, whatever, and say, would you like to tether, yes or no? And if you tapped yes by accident, it would be less secure. And then you had to go through an absolute hell of a process to get that undone, which annoyed me to no end. Thankfully, that's changed. Now it's a opt-in setting where you've got to go and dig around and set that wireless network or Wi-Fi connection or Bluetooth peripheral or whatever to tether. And to be honest, I have not ever done that in the last several years, and I've got no intention to start anytime soon. Besides which, I use fingerprint authentication to unlock my device. It's nice, it's quick, it's convenient, and honestly, the tethering is not going to do me any favors there. Then a bit more about the MDM or mobile device management platforms. So they're going to help you with the policy and configuration implementation services. As I said earlier, consider it to be Active Directory for your phones or your tablets. Makes it easier to think of it as a very useful administrative tool. Now, it is going to require an agent application in most cases to be installed on the device, as Android and iOS are not really designed to be enterprise machines, so their ability to join a domain and be managed is generally not built into the mobile OS. Although, in fairness to both Apple and Google, they've been doing a lot over the years to make Android and iOS more secure and more suitable for work purposes, but they're not quite there yet. As I said earlier as well, there's a large variety available, so there's no need to rely on your handset vendor for the solution. In some cases, actually, the third-party solutions are way more interesting and exciting and more fun to work with than anything that comes from Apple or Google. And where you can, try and make sure it integrates with a conventional domain controller, as this makes it more worthwhile to have, as you can at least have both your mobile and your conventional computers working together and possibly even being viewable under a single administrative console or dashboard. So try and find an MDM with those nice integration features, as it makes it more worthwhile to have. And also, like I said earlier, see if you can get a feature that allows you to separate your work and your personal stuff on the mobile device. It'll be very useful. This is a very MDM dependent feature though, so pay attention to the characteristics and feature set of the product. And also price point, because you might be surprised how much you have to pay for that feature. Depends on the MDM. And you might even get MAM available with your mobile device manager. Now, in Mobile Application Manager, or MAM, allows you more control over the apps that will be available for the user for work purposes. This could either be with an app blocking feature, or even hosting a little miniature enterprise app store, where you can pre-screen and upload apps that you are okay with from the mobile handset's official app store. Now, the reason why you still want to go and do this, even if you're just basically reposting what's in the app store, is when it gets downloaded from the MAM app store. It'll also come along with enterprise settings, features, and access rights preloaded, making the enrollment a lot easier, and also making it easier for the MDM to distinguish that this app is there for work purposes, not personal purposes, and should be protected as such. So it's a feature also worth looking into. But honestly, you should go through the MDM capabilities when you're looking at one and decide for yourself what's going to be best for your organization. At the end of the day, I'm just some random dude on the internet. You must make your informed choices. But that was that for this video. Bit of a short one by comparison, but we've touched on a lot of these things already in the previous videos, so there's no point me driving on longer than needed with this particular video. Nonetheless though, I would like to say thank you all for watching. I always appreciate it, and if you haven't done so already, please drop a like, subscribe, and if you've got any friends, family members, or co-workers interested in things like Security Plus or LPI's Security Essentials, share this with them. They'll appreciate it. Otherwise though, have a good one, and I'll catch you in the next video.